Hello everyone, I would like to introduce you all to the FIU Cyber Physical Systems Security Lab IoT Management System, or for short, the FIU CSL Check-in app, which is an application that we developed this spring 2024 Capstone 2 semester in order to more efficiently check in or check out devices from the CSL lab at the FIU engineering campus, right? So let's just get started. Our objective this semester was to make the challenges of renting devices in the CSO at FIU much smaller, right? Or mitigate them entirely. The CSL lab contains a lot of devices, and frankly, keeping track of all of them, seeing who's taking them home and whatnot, can be very time consuming, aside from the fact that it can also take time from people that are actually at the lab, right? So the application aims to create a user friendly interface for device rental and make it as efficient as possible with as little human communication, right? There's no point in having people in the lab use their time on this when they could be doing the research they need to be doing. So as of when it comes to the challenges of renting devices, like I kind of was mentioning in the introduction, you know, renting equipment from a lab can be time consuming, no matter what, right? It could be at the CSL lab or it could be in any lab within FIU itself, right? Inventory tracking can be complex, aside from the fact that people have to always be paying attention to who's walking in and out of the lab. You know, the CSL checking app aims to simplify this process, right? We are keeping track of who's renting what in our database. We're making sure that we are actually assigning devices to people whenever they're being rented. We just want to make sure that this process is as efficient and as fast as possible. And this is actually, done using QR codes. All the devices in the CSL lab will begin to have QR codes that are going to be scannable by the application, and the users will then be able to see what they're renting depending on what is being scanned, right? When it comes to the tech stack of the application, the entire development process involved using Flutter and Dart, right? Alongside Back4 app and C++, Ruby, Swift, and HTML, as you can see. The reason why I'm saying it revolved around Flutter is due to the fact that this is a framework that was actually developed by Google that utilizes Dart, which is a programming language also created by Google, that essentially streamlines the development process of mobile applications for both iOS and Android, right? It makes it so you could use one code base for the development of the, you know, two OSs. So actually, to talk more about that, uh, Flutter and Dart, are a cross-platform framework and programming language for developing iOS and Android applications, right? And really, the main takeaway that you have from Flutter is that it provides a centralized code base for both Android and iOS development. What does this mean? It essentially makes it so that you don't have to be going to Swift code to change something in your iPhone version of the application, and you don't have to go to Kotlin or something like that in order to change the code or a functionality for Android devices. It's all done within the same classes where Flutter will then take care of utilizing the programming languages I mentioned earlier, such as C++ or Ruby, to actually you know create the functionality via the application. When it comes to Back4 app, um, Back4 app is essentially a backend as a service platform that we utilized that it offers a bunch of things such as database management, user authentication, and cloud functions. We decided to go with Back4 app due to the fact that it really it took off a whole chunk of our development process. It made it so that we could simply say, hey, we need to be able to somehow track the devices that people are renting, and we need to be able to do it from anywhere in the world, realistically, right? So so yeah, the Back4 app takes care of doing all these cloud native functionalities in the application itself, right? The Flutter the Flutter app simply would just have a Back4 app instance that then creates objects of devices, for instance, depending on what object is added onto the database, or then what object is rented by someone, right? So it's really scalable and it's really secure because it makes sure that whenever a user is created, all their data is safely stored as well, right? And then, as I was mentioning earlier, when it comes to C++, Ruby, etc., all these things are really just aspects that are already included in Flutter, right? So so the good thing about this is that it makes it so that you only have to really worry about Dart, and then all this Swift and C++ functionality you can kind of just have in the back of your mind. And for example, if there's an issue with the iOS implementation of the app, you can go to the Swift code and then actually, you edit it depending on what you need the app to do, right? But most of the time, I would say easily 95% of the time, you're coding in Dart, which is the language I mentioned earlier. As for the main features of the application, aside from, the obvious device management features that I've been talking about so far, there's a really big emphasis on user authentication, because at the end of the day, you need to know who's renting a device, you need to know who's going home with what devices, and then you need to know when they're returning them, right? So there's a really big emphasis on authentication and the rental system as a whole. As I mentioned earlier, you actually scan devices, you scan the QR codes that are pasted onto devices, but the way you log in into the app can be into different ways, which we'll talk about more in the actual demo of the application. But for the most part, you can either sign up either A, creating an account if you're not affiliated to FIU, or B, which is the mainstream way, is to use your one card. As you can see, Rory's on here. As for the user authentication, as I also kind of mentioned earlier, Back4App kind of takes care of this entire process. It makes sure that whenever a user creates an account, for example, the password can only be actually seen in the database if you have special administrator privileges, for example, right? Nobody can access that data. Same thing with your Panther ID, same thing with the device, manufacturing info, right? There's a lot of data that is very sensitive in the system as a whole. So you have to make sure that it's being stored safely, right? So Back4App does all of this for us, right? We didn't have to create our own user authentication system from scratch. So that was something that we really leveraged utilizing Back4App. When it comes to device management, um, this is all entirely done just kind of checking like the object IDs of the devices and the users, right? Which are just like the primary keys in a relational database. That's the way you could think about it, right? So the iPhone 15 in this case will have, a key such as 123 ABC, and it is rented by user ABC123, right? So then you can very easily check who is renting what at what time. So in this case, you have a user renting, say, this drone, a DJI Mavic 3 Pro, and an iPhone 15. You know that this info is being safely stored in Back4App as well, right? The rental system, I already kind of went over it, really. Where the one thing I didn't mention is the fact that users can just input the date ranges they want, right? So if you want to rent a device for 20 days, you can do so. For now, that's how the application works. For the development process, we utilize Scrum, much like every other Capstone 2 project. We really try to meet with the product owner as often as possible. But the one thing that made our requirement analysis a little bit more unique is that we actually had to go to the CSL lab pretty often and see, what devices there were in the lab, and see if using QR codes was even going to be feasible in the first place, right? And as the development process went along, as the design phase came along, for example, we had to see how we are going to make it so the application was as user friendly as possible. It's supposed to be, at the end of the day, for you to log in into an app and rent a device should take no more than like 5 taps, right? You put in your information, you go to a checkout, you scan the device, you input the number of days, and then you're done, right? So that's why we really focused on. For the conclusion, really, the last couple of weeks have been, up to the last couple of weeks of the melon process has really been just testing and making sure that the application is sending proper data to the database, and furthermore making sure that the requirements of the product owner were met properly, right? And really that puts us at the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening.